Fantasy Animation is a completely free online educational resource dedicated to examining the relationship between fantasy storytelling and the medium of animation. We publish blog posts from academics, animators, and VFX artists for people to access, as well as these podcasts that take listeners on an informative but hopefully entertaining journey through the fascinating world of fantasy animation. To find out more, visit fantasy-animation.org or subscribe via your favourite podcast subscription service. While you're there, give us a quick like, click the subscribe button, or give us a quick review while you're at it, as we could always use the extra help. For now, do enjoy the show.
Hello listeners and welcome to the latest episode of this Fantasy Animation podcast with me, Chris Holliday.
And me, Alex Sargent.
So for this episode we are going underground, looking at the Aardman DreamWorks co-production, and I think that co-production element is particularly important. The 2006 animated adventure feature Flushed Away, with an astonishing voice cast actually. Hugh Jackman, Kate Winslet and Ian McKellen, and also Shane Ritchie, amongst others. So this film is, I mean, we've done Aardman before, but this is a really interesting moment in Aardman's history. So a period of about 4 or 5 years where they made a couple of computer animated films as a sort of I guess a test out or a testing ground, and haven't returned to computer animated filmmaking since. So Flushed Away and Arthur Christmas, which is a film that I'd love to also talk to you about, is represents an interesting historical moment, I think, within the industrial history of Aardman and its sort of relationship to the broader Hollywood computer animated film industry. So yeah, and it was also one of my PhD films, so nice to revisit after quite some time. Alex, you watched it relatively recently for the first time?
I watched it but this morning, Chris. Yes, and I know this is a film that you reference a lot in your thinking and in your writing, and it's one of those delightful examples of a film that seems to speak to so much of your your research interests, and yet perhaps hasn't got, from the casual observer would be like, why of all the ones are they doing Flushed Away? And hopefully by the end of this episode we'll answer some of those questions. I've got some sprinklings of fantastical thoughts.
Lovely.
As I always do. And I'll be really excited to talk about how this chimes with your work, because we don't need a guest this week, Chris, because you are expert on this film, because you write very eloquently about it in your book, and it becomes part of an important way you sort of theorise the computer animated film. So I'm excited to sort of unpack it with you. You said in your introduction we've done Aardman before.
Yeah.
Maybe just as an on-air meeting, have we done Aardman before?
Yes, we.
And if what have we done?
I'm heartbroken. You don't remember Pirates and Adventure? Scientists?
Of course we did. Of course. Yes, we did. In many ways, then we're doing two very atypical.
Yes.
Aardman movies as our first two, because I think I don't always think Aardman when I think Pirates, because we talked in that episode about how there are certain aspects of the fantasy register that I think makes me feel a bit differently about it. And I think that's true of this film in many ways. So that's interesting that in forgetting, I have found a link between the two movies that I think does signal the somehow atypical Aardman films.
Well, I suppose on the flip side, and obviously we talked about Pirates with one of the animators, Richard Haynes, and in many ways, you're right that there is such a thing as a typical Aardman, and what we've perhaps done inadvertently on the podcast is think about what Aardman might mean in different kinds of contexts. Now, obviously, a lot of debate and writing around Aardman, and in fact, both of us have written pieces on Aardman in relation to sort of, I guess, the handmade and claymation and the sort of default narratives that seem to structure an engagement with, or scholarly engagement with Aardman as a studio. And yet, at the same time, for this week, we're doing a film that was a test. I think both it's a test for us, but also it was a test for Aardman. They just brokered this deal with DreamWorks. It was a highly lucrative, or at the time considered a highly lucrative collaboration of sort of a successful British studio, a successful Hollywood studio. And I think that the terms of that creative partnership, I think, on the one hand, play out in the film itself and the way in which there is a collision between two worlds. This is a film about a collision between two spaces. A very kind of craft-based space down below and a very kind of pristine and glossy space up top, which has a lot of actual intertextual references and playful gestures to DreamWorks films of the past. And so that collaboration is plays out in the narrative of the film, but also plays out, I think, at the level of form, where you've got this collaboration between two mediums. You've got the digital technology for which DreamWorks, and we'll be doing DreamWorks in the future on this podcast, but a collision between the CG world of DreamWorks animation and the claymation craft-based artisanal world of Aardman coming together in this film.
And I guess the thing to play through and play out as we chat about it is how successfully that joining together is, and I'm conscious that I don't want to go down sort of simple narratives, because I think the standard critical dismissal of this movie, because it wasn't a commercial or critical hit, right?
Yeah.
It got sort of mediocre reviews and a mediocre box office is sort of how I would describe it. But the standard narrative was, oh, what a shame, Aardman have sort of sold out or have been... either they have sold out or have been forced by the big evil American behemoth company to sort of do things in the standard CGI computer fashion, and don't we all wish it was animated? And I think there's something interesting about... and I'm glad to talk to you about it, in that, like, I'd be interested to talk about how the level of creativity, because it's, those narratives play into very sort of, boring and notions of nationality on top of, the British animation industry and what we think that means versus the American animation industry and what we think that means. And I think we could probably do well to complicate some of that whilst talking about the movie, which I think does have some kind of obvious problems if we go down that road.
No, there's lots to say about this film in relation to exactly that point about the default rhetoric of preservation and the desire from popular and critical discourse to sort of assure audiences that don't worry, it's still Aardman, that trademark Aardman won't be forgotten within this collision with DreamWorks. And obviously this is a momentous moment for Aardman. They're declaring that shift, or that decision to shift from stop motion to CGI for its feature films. At the time, Peter Lord of Aardman is talking about the studio's emergent digital future at the expense of claymation, and actually the narrative of Flushed Away and a lot of the ways in which the film was justified was it's a lot to do with water, and we couldn't possibly do water in stop motion. So thank goodness, we don't need to become attached to this traditional technique. And Lord says a lot of people were wary, but you've got a different toolbox here, and he says, and this is a quote, an awful lot of possibilities. So I'm interested in actually Flushed Away and to some extent Arthur Christmas as these sorts of two co-productions, Flushed Away with DreamWorks and then Arthur Christmas with Sony Pictures once the contract with DreamWorks went south. These are curious sites of negotiation, because they're sort of films that occupy a conciliatory position between two types of image making. So I think there's certainly lots to say on the industrial front, and then, as you say, that the film itself kind of looks a little bit Aardman-y and has Aardman flourishes in the way that its characters are designed, but perhaps kind of bears out in its narrative a degree of chaos as these two studios are fighting for prominence.
So I guess in many ways this is a sort of prequel podcast to the Pirates episode, in that Pirates seems to be just that note on water as well, a nice sort of the way Aardman seem to, at least for now, have reconciled those two tendencies, in that Pirates has quite a lot of CGI in it and there's a lot of water in it as a nice neat sort of parallel, and yet it maintains that kind of cozy handmade feel, whether a reality or, in to be honest, a fantasy of a cozy handmade feel that that we want to associate with the studio for various reasons. I guess we should, rather than talk about what we might talk about, we should start talking about the film itself. And I'm going to steal your thunder straight away, because I suspect you already know this, but I was struck by the opening of the film. So the film opens with our main character, Roddy St. James.
Roddy St. James, yes.
Roddy St. James, this sort of aristocratic mouse. No, well, rat. Is it a rat or a mouse?
He's
an Aardman creature.
I think he's a mouseified rat.
A mouseified, like it, mouseified rat. rat passing as mouse, if you will, in this sort of Kensington, lovely penthouse, and we get what I've written down, very Toy Story-esque opening, in that what you get is this, unseen child sort of saying goodbye to Roddy. She's off on her holidays, and then as this sort of the human presence leaves into the still room, suddenly this rat Roddy pops out and starts playing with all the toys. They start coming back to life again. The difference, obviously, the toys aren't alive. Roddy's sort of making them pretend to be alive, but there's this opening sequence where the king of the bedroom, the real king of the bedroom, Roddy, comes in a very Woody-esque manner to wake up the animated spaces in the bedroom. So I know you're going to say it already, and you have said it. But to steal your thunder, I couldn't believe that I knew why we were watching this movie, and in those first 3 minutes, I was like, oh, right, this is very Toy Story already.
So yeah, the opening sequence, or the opening credits of the sequence, play out by establishing London as a location before we then go into this Kensington townhouse, and it sort of does. You're right. It sort of plays with the Toy Story narrative, but also in a way that emphasizes Roddy's loneliness. The point is that these toys don't come to life, and he plays up volleyball. He has a checklist of things he's going to do whilst his owners, his faceless human owners, because CGI is not quite there yet when it comes to the representation of human faces. We've had Final Fantasy and The Incredibles a couple of years earlier, so we're still not quite there yet. So the easiest thing to do is just truncate them so they're faceless. But family goes on holiday. He comes up with this list of things he's going to do. Movie premiere, where we get the obligatory Bond reference. Tick.
Very nice. Yeah.
And he goes to a movie premiere. He plays volleyball. He kind of gets dressed up and all this sort of stuff. And there's lots of interesting things to say about cinephilia and DVDs, and he's obviously a film fan, and I love all of that stuff. He does a really active slide in front of this DVD shelf, puts on a film, a movie, a fake fictional Bond movie to watch. But the emphasis, and I think the song is Dancing With Myself, Billy Idol. I think it's Billy Idol. And it's really supposed to emphasise his loneliness, and it's not really until he partners up with Rita, voiced by Kate Winslet, that he finds some sort of degree of sanctuary, because he has all the trappings of a Kensington life. He has his sort of gold encrusted cage, and he lives a relatively affluent life, but he lives an affluent life on his own. And you're right, there's a little gesture, a little playful nod to the world of Toy Story, and the drama of the fact that these are toys that he plays with, but they will only ever remain sort of inanimate.
So I've got two impossible questions for you this week.
Lovely.
I'll probably have more, but hey, this time I think we're on solid ground. The first is that parallel between Toy Story and Flushed Away an easy but perhaps kind of cheap point of notice between the two of us, or does it speak to something wider about the way in which computer animated movies, or the kinds of narratives, or the kinds of narrative situations that computer animated films set up? Or is it just kind of a nice, lovely coincidence that the first CGI Aardman movie starts with a very Toy Story-esque sequence? So that's my first one. And then my second one, which is just an augmentation of that, is that is there anything significant about the fact that this is slightly different, in that what Toy Story is a sort of animation of lifeless objects? This is a reminder of the objectness of those objects in a kind of more kind of ironic way.
Yeah.
There you go.
Well, I think the second point, the is this a reminder? Yes, because and actually I've not really thought about that. The objectness of the toys that don't come to life is a sort of reminder of they need external force, and it's sort of doing through CGI what Aardman does in its other features. It's sort of playing with objects. It's a film about animation, Alex, in a way.
Right.
But there is something about that. I think the first question actually, I was thinking about magical realism. So I was thinking about this idea of magical realism, and I know that you are ambivalent towards the term magical realism as a way of defining forms of fantasy, and I vaguely remember that you are. It's rooted somewhere in my brain. But magical realism, as it's been understood, I think, in literature, or one of the ways it's been understood in literature, is that it has very few cinematic equivalences. And Toy Story is very close to magical realism. It's about the realism that exists, I guess, as sort of intrusive fantasy, if we're thinking in those terms. And I, of course, now do. thanks to you. But there's something about what does magical realism mean in film, and I was thinking about the relationship in my book about Toy Story and like the Indian in the cupboard, like the real world, and then what's really happening is that Toy Story is interested in the magic that resides within the corners of a domestic space that adults don't see and only children see. Fine. And so this film is very similar to that, and I wonder whether a lot of animation is about that. It's about our real world, and it goes into the world of Basil the Great Mouse Detective, or it goes into the world of Andy's room, and we go into all these different humdrum domestic spaces, and within there lies the magic of animation. In the case of Flushed Away, it's a nice parallel, whether or not this is an intentional parallel. But it's supposed to. One of the things I think it does differently is that the film would feel very different if it stayed in that Kensington flat. And what the film is really good at is within 10 minutes or so taking him out of that flat, and suddenly what the film is, and the film gets a lot better for me when it's in a slightly scruffy, handmade version of London, and you get this really nice parallel between the world up top and the world down below, which is why that credit sequence is so important. It announces Flushed Away against landmarks of Piccadilly Circus and Tower Bridge, and against the backdrop of England versus Germany in the World Cup final. So there's your fantasy. But
yes, quite.
But then when we go into the world of the sewers and he gets flushed away, and Roddy, it's a classic fish out of water narrative, and there's a little reference to Nemo where he catches an orange fish, and the fish says, "Have you seen my dad?" And it's a little gag towards Nemo. You get a nice parallel between the world up top and then this world down below, which is a version of London that is cobbled together and built from rubbish and junk and waste, which is also something I'm interested in relation to these movies. So I don't know whether the relationship to Toy Story was deliberate, but it is a nice little evocation of the objectness of the world and the lack of fantasy in that world in a way that does nicely parallel Toy Story.
And I guess it to sort of, really push it as far as we can with this, what it also does is that, of course, there are two kind of opening bits of Toy Story, which again you write well about, in that we have the sort of bit where Andy plays with the toys, and and they are lifeless, and then of course the toys come to life and they move around without Andy, and that's obviously, as you say, I think there is a certain magical realist quality to the animation in that it's sort of interested in the overt fantasy of a toy coming to life, but what it's really interested in is the sort of imaginative possibility of that space under the bedroom, of that corner of your room you can't quite reach when you're a child, and you occasionally leave things in. So, and I don't hate the term magical realist. I just think it's often used badly. It's often used as a legitimizing word or label. Basically, what magical people often mean when they say magical realists are fantasy films with a brain, and I think all fantasy films have a brain, so that's why I don't really like the term. But actually, the roots of it are exactly in what you're saying about, actually the world is realist, but the approach to the world becomes magically inflected. So I like that aspect of it. But then, of course, what Flushed Away does is Roddy becomes both Andy and Woody, in that he is both the centre of this world, the locus point of the magical realism, but also the player and the mover and the shaker and the person that moves and is, the puppeteer, I think, as you've said about Andy. So there's something about that difference in that's kind of what the film's trying to do. The film's trying to be Toy Story whilst maintaining that sense of the handheld and maintaining that sense of a person moving objects and there being pleasure in that physicality as well. So in a way, the oddness of that opening sequence speaks to the tension of the entire film, to kind of push it even further.
Yeah, no, that's. I suppose that feeds into Roddy as a character, because the point is that he is pampered, and he lives this life of luxury, and he doesn't really have to do anything, and that's he is a sort of, in many ways, he is as inanimate as the people that he plays volleyball with, or the toys he plays volleyball with. He doesn't really need to do anything, and it's only when Sid is a sewer rat who intrudes into this world and ultimately is the one who pulls the chain. He tries to convince Roddy that this is or they have a conversation about how a toilet is a jacuzzi, and then ultimately Roddy gets flushed away into this world down below, which we'll come to. But I quite like that idea. He is both puppeteer as a way of organising his world, a world in which he is of control, and then as soon as he gets transplanted to the world below, which looks like, I don't know, because it's emphasis on junk, and it's not that it's like an typical Aardman film because of that, but there's something very tangible and very material about a world that's been evidently and visually cobbled together by the people that live there. And I'm really interested in the creation of junk cities and these sorts of garbage landscapes in computer animated films, because it's the detritus that gets thrown away up top becomes the way of living for the rats down below, and it's only when he then gets flushed away to this world of scavengers and hunters and people that create worlds and build worlds, they are world builders, that he sort of he starts to become more of an agent. He's very much an object up top but an agent down below, and that's the two worlds nicely split. His role is both created and subject, and then creator and object down below.
So let's go on then, because I'm keen for this podcast not to be like all our podcasts where we spend the entire hour speaking about the first 5 minutes of the movie. So let's get flushed away and go to the garbage city. So what is it about? Is that a thing that's in more CGI movies then? This sort of the garbage city or the construction of garbage towns?
Yes, and thank you for queuing up something that we secretly talked about off air. That's wonderful. Yes, so I'm certainly, and this came from watching, and this is I suppose one of the perils of genre analysis. You watch a group of films together in a way that perhaps they weren't intended to be watched together, and you come up, it's film noir all over again, but these common features. And as I was watching computer animated films, I was interested in the value and the way that they're sort of drawn to the miniature, and also what that relationship is between miniature worlds, i.e. the world under the bed, the world down below, and the pipes under Paris, or all these sorts of miniature worlds, and cultural detritus, junk, and everyday objects that are sort of being reassembled in unconventional ways. Now, perhaps WALL-E is the sort of chief text in this sense. You know, it's all about scavenging and hunting and the pleasure of junk spaces, and you get that really brilliant bit at the beginning of WALL-E where you think you're looking at skyscrapers, and when the cloud and the smog clears, actually it's just blocks and blocks of garbage. Now, DreamWorks have got form for this, so their film Ants from 1998 is all about the journey to Insectopia, and it turns out that all these ants travel to Insectopia, and what happens, it's just a garbage overflowing garbage bin, and it's sort of that ethos of pleasure and utopia in junk that is continued in lots and lots of computer animated films. So you get Bug City from A Bug's Life, which is this sort of big city place that is made up of because these are ants and bugs. From their level, takeaway boxes become theatres and pubs, and there are there's a bustling modern metropolis that is created out of things that have been thrown away. So it's objects that have given away one life as a container, as that suddenly become renewed and energised in this world. Seen from a Bug's perspective, and so this is definitely true with a film like Flushed Away, because it is entirely, its version of London that exists underground is entirely based on the sort of the thrown away and that kind of micro city that's composed entirely of reclaimed items. And I do think there's something about computer animated films that are fascinated by the afterlives of certain kinds of objects. Of course, this is because of the visual pristine illusionism of digital technology being able to really get to grips with the dirty and the grubby and the grimy. But what I like about Flushed Away is that it recreates that tourist image of London, and actually it compresses it. It has landmarks that would never be next to each other, but compresses them together, and you get this touristic view of London that is made from porcelain mugs and old toilets and dishwashers and discarded food and jukeboxes and an old boot, and so I love that. And this is because Rita as a character builds her boat, the Jammy Dodger, from entirely reclaimed items. So I really like the way that the film engages with like bike chains and rusty screws and objects that are well worn through multiple uses, and then here the film affords them another use. But for me it's certainly a trend that and you don't really realise it, but loads of animated films are really interested in rubbish and sort of the culture of detritus, and I don't exactly know why, but maybe it positions these films within a long tradition of junk art, or the reclaimed item, or the ready-made, or is it a kind of political statement about the environment? I mean, there's lots going on in these movies, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess it's also that form of object play is quite a sort of well-worn, interest of fantasy theorists, and that it recreates a way of looking at the world that is very much associated with sort of play tendency and creative tendencies, and I think it's Winnicott, the sort of famous theorist of play, who kind of talks about object function versus object usage in sort of early sort of childhood development, and again in adult, where like an object function is where you associate the object with its sort of objective functional purpose within an intersubjective shared reality. So if you want to make a cup of tea, you need to fetch a mug, because a mug's function is to drink hot drinks out of, in my case, far too much tea and far too much coffee, and that's what a function of the mug is. So my relationship to the mug is its function, but an object usage is far more flexible, in that a mug, he says, actually doing it, because why not, even though it's just Chris looking at me, if I put it on the top of my head, is a wonderful little hat, and then it becomes something I can use that doesn't have necessarily a fixed function, and that requires a level of creativity and subjective expression, because it's all about what I can bring to the mug, as opposed to what the mug belongs to the external world of reality. So I guess and I guess animation is kind of a big fan of that, right? It takes a pen and a pencil and plays with what can come out of it. And Winnicott certainly was very interested in that in his own writing, on how pens and papers and doodles and things like that could allow that kind of form of subjective object usage to be brought out of a person. So I guess there is a chime between what animation is as an art form and this idea to reclaim objects as different usage. And I'm even thinking with Aardman, actually, the film, my favourite Aardman movie, which we will do on the podcast eventually, is Chicken Run. And there's a lot in Chicken Run about, like, I think the contraption they fly away from the farm on is made of like old pencils and like bits of the old chicken shed and all that kind of stuff being reclaimed and reused and repurposed. Where garbage comes into all this, I don't know, but it is an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, no, I absolutely, and I'd not made that link to fantasy. I'm interested and have written on this idea of kind of object substitution and pretend play, and the way in which a lot of animated characters sort of take discarded waste and place it into new functional identities. And I think that certainly, as you said, appeals to that sort of creative spirit of children who are able to infuse those kinds of objects with sort of false representations that this is, and part of a socializing project. And these moments of transformation are, I think, sort of investigational acts that are rooted in what would happen if I took this, and this stick can be a sword, but it can also be a horse, and I could run around and play with it, and then it could also be a barrier or a wall, and so these kinds of transformations, I think, are that are rooted in those sorts of substitutional behaviours, really take on new meanings when it's the repurposing of junk and waste that's allowed momentarily to stand in for other more functional identities. And I think that's, certainly, you get this a lot. Wall-E, again, is a good example, because he plays with a lot of kind of toys, and there's a really great bit in Wall-E where he picks up the diamond ring and throws away the diamond ring to play with the box, and it's like, that's what these films do. That's what these films are more interested in, not the shiny diamond, than interested in that box, because that box could be really useful, couldn't it? And I feel like that's increased by animators who are like, that box could be a character, and we could goes back to Pixar's history. We could take this lamp, let's cast this lamp in a role and see what it can do. But crucially, it's these, we don't get the metamorphosis. We don't get the kind of culture of quick change. What we get in a lot of these computer animated films is a fidelity to their material properties. And actually, what the change that happens is not through a sort of slippery, slimy transformation of this into this. It's right. Well, a lamp has to just be like this. So how can we work with the dimensions of it to turn it into a parent and a child? So this is how we're going to do it. So they sort of cast an object in a role and then work with the way and work with how it can manifest an idea of character, and I love computer animated films for kind of manipulating objects in this way, taking an object, thinking about the variant possibilities that are engendered by these potential substitutional activities, and how that might fit into a sort of a discourse of play and a discourse of symbolism, of metaphor, of a conceptual representation of what this object could be and whether that relates to a child's cognitive and social development.
That's interesting, yeah. And I guess that's what gives it this magical realist quality, and that's the point, is that the objective world doesn't change, but the subjective approach to it, the animation spirit or energy is in that approach to the objective materialism that the photorealism of CGI is so able to sort of capture. But it's about how you then repurpose these objects. And I guess that's interesting in the sense that I thought we were going to say those kind of things about stop motion as we were starting this episode, because of course stop motion is arguably the most material of all of the animation forms. So, but it's a different kind of materiality, right? In that most, well, no, I don't know most, but Aardman stop motion isn't about taking real life objects and, it's not, they don't animate shoes. They don't animate. They animate, clay that is manipulated to look like these things. So there's always the material object is real and in the world and pro-filmic in that respect. But the material object is also an illusion that represents something else rather than being the object in and of itself.
Yeah, and I think that's the split between stop-motion animation and object animation, i.e. object animation is something that we might attribute to Jan Svankmajer, or the Brothers Quay, or people like that who are working and repurposing and building characters out of everyday bits and pieces and quite explicit in that. But stop-motion in the way that Aardman do it, I cannot buy that object, I mean, probably now because of merchandising, but I don't have Gromit just a hand and we'll just animate. That's a character, and that's created in a way that it's supposed to be a character who isn't built. We know it's built from plasticine and so forth, but it's not built as a character in the same way. Svankmajer, his film Meat Love, which has basically got a big slab of meat that walks across a thing and then jumps into the flour, jumps into the salt and pepper, and it's taking the everyday objects that exist in the world and then manipulating. This is what Suzanne Buchan calls animation's special powers, is that puppet animation has a very different ontology and object animation has a very different ontology to cell animation and to computer animation, because the object is there, as you say, pro-filmically, and it's only through animation's special powers that it comes to life. And that's why a lot of object animation is taking something. And I think that's what Luxo Jr., Pixar's short film, tries to do. Pays a debt to those traditions, but sort of does it within a three-dimensional virtual space.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the three-dimensional is both a sort of a way of reclaiming the objective, and yet is the least objective, I guess, of all the animation forms, in that it can be as abstract as it wants, but what we do is we develop these sort of very complicated computer systems to make it fit the physics of the world, which I think perhaps we could speculate on in future episodes and things like that, because I think that's an interesting thing to think through. But we're in the sewers.
Speak for yourself.
and we have yes. But viewers can decide whether it literally or metaphorically. But we're down in the gutter, in amongst the trash, and Roddy is a bit out of sorts. And then he comes across. This is classic. Alex doesn't know any of the characters' names anymore because he only watched it this morning. The Kate Winslet character, Rita, who I'd like to talk about a bit, because I think that's a very interesting. Well, I think it's a very interesting choice of... Well, the pairing of voice artists to character interested me quite a lot in this movie, in that, obviously, this is the second film in as many episodes where Hugh Jackman has done an odd accent throughout the entire movie. So Hugh Jackman is this upper-class British rat mouse, and then he comes across Kate Winslet, who is voicing Rita, who is this kind of, I don't know, Eliza Doolittle-esque kind of, Eliza Doolittle with a bit of Catherine Hepburn from The African Queen kind of merged together, but very much doing a sort of, Americanized Cockney accent. I know Kate Winslet is British, but put it this way, I think there's some interesting things to talk about in terms of class and the representation of class in this movie and the boundaries between animals and class. And I think the idea at the heart where you've got Kate Winslet, who is who has a pretty received pronunciation accent, doing this kind of cartoonish working class East End girl accent throughout the movie to represent Rita, who's very much coded as being a sort of working class rat compared to Roddy, is an interesting vocal choice as to why you go there. I'm not sure I have much more to say about that stage, but we can keep going and we'll see if we get to Ian McKellen as Toad in a minute.
We will. So it is probably painting with a very broad brush, or obviously. There is this relationship between the two characters, so Roddy and Rita, and what they represent, and the sort of social and political imaginaries that circulate around a person who lives alone up top, and then Rita, whose house is sort of balanced perilously on an oil drum, and it's full of people and children are running around, and she's this sort of scavenger who enjoys the world by building the world. And of course the whole narrative is about this powerful duel and so forth, and the things that we value the most. And it turns out, of course, that Roddy doesn't value up top. He values this, I think he says, would you like a shipmate? And he ends up staying and all this sort of stuff. Maybe it is being too obvious, but it very easily does map onto the glossy world of Hollywood DreamWorks, and then the sort of as a financial backer and as business and as a company who had worked in animation, television products, commercial, and then Aardman, who are this bespoke. They are not a major producer of animated films in the same way as Aardman. They are partnering up with Spielberg's DreamWorks company to hopefully become this leading player in the animation market. And so suddenly you've got this collision of two worlds that might map onto that industrial union between DreamWorks. So they brokered this deal in '97, so not that about 10 years before Flushed Away, to co-finance and distribute Chicken Run. And then in 1999, they've signed this 12-year, 4-film, $250 million agreement with DreamWorks to produce these animated features, of which they ended up producing, Flushed Away, essentially, because it didn't work out, and there is all these sorts of this give and take, this industrial give and take between this small Bristol-based Aardman studio, and whether that would be swallowed, as you said at the start, would it be able to maintain its visibility in Hollywood as a result of this sort of, I suppose to use the analogy in the film, this engulfing tidal wave of Hollywood money and so forth. And so it's very simplistic to review the film's relationship in this way, but I just wonder whether the film's value, or the emphasis that the film places on the value of the world down below, and the sort of grubby working class, craft-based, family-oriented world and community-based world of the world down below, this sort of Ratropolis that is based on the London up top. The London up top is very hollow, it's very empty, it's very open and very very minimalist, and the world down below is bustling with people and junk and rubbish, and maybe it is too obvious to say, look, these are the studios that these worlds represent. But there is something, I think, striking about what the film does in terms of creating the world of Roddy as this really affluent, Kensington posh town mouse.
Well, I don't know if it is if it's too obvious. I think it's very tempting, and I think there's a way of doing it simplistically. But I was struck watching it. Well, I think what is important to talk about with Aardman is that Aardman's, identity as a studio and its cherished nature as a sort of British institution is very much tied in with a certain transnational relationship with America, I guess. But it's also tied in with a national relationship with kind of, I think, kind of with folkcraft. I've sort of tried to link in my own work on Aardman's relationship to British fantastical traditions. And people kind of have the wrong impression of what British fantasy has looked like historically, because of people like Tolkien and Lewis, these sort of great big high fantasy British authors. Everyone thinks that kind of model of fantasy is sort of quintessentially British. But if anything, that kind of, epic, triumphant world building, that sense of romanticism in the world building, is an American trait of fantasy, not a British trait. British folklore, British fantastical traditions is very much rooted in disruption and the homeliness and in folk art. And British folk art is very much, this idea of bottom up rather than top down. It's weaving baskets as a response to the industrialization of the North. It's romanticizing and fantasizing about cottage industries, collective enterprises, and this is sort of types back right to the sort of romantic roots of fantasy literature. Tobin Siebers talks a lot about this, that the romantic movement, as in romantic with a capital R, is very much linked with this idea of fantastical storytelling. And people like William Morris are writing some of the first works of fantasy literature, whilst also, designing wallpaper, ornate sort of, craft-based sort of visions of art. And I think that's all tied up in our approach to Aardman, because Aardman is both sort of as a storytelling stable, because the kind of Aardman stories we expect are kind of slightly more scrappy, slightly more subversive, slightly more intrusive rather than immersive in their rhetoric. Wallace and Gromit is not a story about a fantasy world, but the fantasy world of Wallace and Gromit is writ large throughout the piece. And it's linked to this fantastical idea of Aardman as this sort of lovely cottage-based studio based in Bristol, where everyone wears, big jumpers and crawls about and animates with plasticine, which they don't. But, people, that kind of homely brand identity for the studio is so part of how we're supposed to consume Aardman and love Aardman that it's hard not to sort of see a certain anxiety for that and how and what you do with that. And I think the film doesn't always know whether it wants to try and do something different from that identity because it is a CGI movie, or try to somehow use the CGI to speak to that same cultural fantasy of the homemade. And that's perhaps where the tensions play out. So I don't think it is too obvious. I just think it's important to sort of, nuance it. And, I think we're doing that.
I suppose, obviously, this isn't a claymation. The characters look like claymation, and they're built from digital clay. And there's some interesting stuff around the articulation or the re-articulation of Aardman's signature stop-motion puppets in CGI, and actually what this film did in terms of the design of the characters, rather than have them as sort of traditional CG characters, they were built as if they were from clay. So they had replacement mouths that they would, rather than have mouths that had articulation points that could be moved in different directions, mouths would be swapped out to create digital stop motion puppets. So the bodies themselves were created out of CG, but they were designed in a way that was deliberately supposed to replicate the practical craft-based world of the handmade that Aardman has become synonymous with, as you said. And I wonder whether that kind of claymation style, where that the style becomes spirit. So claymation is the place where style conflates with this sort of Aardman spirit, their quintessential Aardmanness, where under that umbrella we have visual traditions, or a set of visual traditions, working practices, big jumpers, practical techniques that would sort of, I think, become a lure for studios outside, and for US studios and distributors, and therefore you get Aardman's unique claymation style viewed within, I think, the Hollywood trade press at the time as sort of a welcome anomaly within this world of CG that's engulfed us all. And Toy Story is 95, and 4 years later Aardman is signing a deal with DreamWorks. So it's not like these things were slow burning. It's in this world of CG and digital technology, and the rise of Pixar, and also DreamWorks, who by that point had made Ants and The Prince of Egypt. So there's lots of industrial things that are happening, and the way in which the British studios distinctive voice working practices, its charm, its beauty, its spirit, the specificity of its claymation, all of that sort of stuff, and the handmadeness of it, and associated craft practices are being kind of coming into collision with Hollywood animation, and so you're right. I don't know whether the film, does it write a check that it doesn't quite cash, or does it write a check in invisible ink? I don't know.
But it's interesting because, as you say, like I didn't know that about the sort of the digital clay. So on one hand, there, at least at the level of character design, there seems to be a desire to replicate the same aesthetic of Aardman as before. But at the other level, you're saying that I didn't do very much research on this film, but I did read the Wikipedia page earlier, which, if any students are listening, is not research. And that's kind of where I'm at with it, which is interesting, is that the way it's framed in the Wikipedia page is that Peter Lord says, we wanted to tell this story about water, and we couldn't do it through stop motion. And I'm just interested into sort of that suggests it's a creative decision, but there's also a lot of hearsay around the movie that kind of it was basically a begrudging arrangement with Katzenberg or with DreamWorks, right? And that basically they felt it was a more economical way of getting one of their features out, so why not? There was a certain push, whether that's true or not. There was felt that it was a sort of being begrudgingly forced to try this out rather than something they should do out of their own back. So on one level, there is this desire to sort of see what they can do with CGI that they could not do with stop motion. And as a consequence, I think what it's not. I don't think it's necessarily a surprise that what they do is make a journey narrative, because I mean, and this is very clunkily thought through. Perhaps people with better knowledge of the practice behind both these art forms would know better. But my observation would be that with stop motion, the thing that takes the time is the sets and the construction of sets and the construction of the sort of surrounding worlds. And if you think of something like Chicken Run, it sort of all really takes place in, it's a one location movie. It's all on the farm. Wallace and Gromit, there's a sort of few key locations, but because it's relatively domestic, it's largely, Wallace's house. I mean, not that Wallace's house actually exists, but these are sort of, various sort of spaces that the characters inhabit. Whilst this, they kind of move from place to place throughout the whole thing. And there's this sense of expansiveness and, fluidity in both the sort of literal and metaphorical sense of the movement in the movie that I'm not sure would be quite as easily done in stop motion, because the film's always moving forward here. And it's that sense of expansionness that makes it feel quite not it doesn't feel like an Aardman movie in that way. And what it feels more like is a more, home on the range, in the wild, these sort of American, for want of a better words, movies where characters, fish out of water movies where characters have to journey back to where they were right at the beginning. So I think the change in rhetoric is part of the technological shift. So I don't know, but it did strike me that way.
But it feels like there's an industrial narrative of preservation, which is don't worry, Aardman fans. What we're doing is we're really we're taking Aardman's unique performance style and we're putting it into the computer animated world. So even though it's not workers sitting over a desk playing with clay, it's Autodesk Maya software, we've still got the same facial expressions and character designs and the imperfections at the level of surface and the sort of monobrow that hangs across the plasticine eyes, the frown lines, the overall look of these pre-modeled plasticine heads, the replacement mouths. We're sculpting this digital clay with modeling tools, and so there's this sort of complementary relationship rather than adversarial. And this extends to the sets. You mentioned that the sets and stop motion traditionally, or I suppose the collision between stop motion and digital processing in Flushed Away was you're right, it creates this imagined and expansive world where Roddy is flushed away from one space to the other in this really kind of kinetic sequence where he moves down into the pipes and then gets spewed out into the world below. Now obviously stop motion commonly involves certain kinds of theatrical tricks like false perspectives that craft the illusion of three-dimensional space that gradually reduce in size and scale. And on that note of Chicken Run, you have fake sets, or you have multiple models of different characters at various sizes. You have different kinds of optical effects where you might only have the feet of a human character and it walks into the shot. It plays with depth perception. Centimeters stand in for miles. You have spatial misrepresentation, angular geometry to create a sort of false spatial relation. And apparently they did a similar kind of process in digital technology. Again, whether this is true or not, but there's a real stress to try and say, well, horizon lines, linear perspectives, it might be done on computer, but actually we're doing the same. We're just sort of doing it. We're doing stop motion, but in CG, and there isn't this sea change. It's really just adapting, and there is this complementary relationship between what Aardman do and what DreamWorks do, and Aardman are having as much of an influence on the way that computer animated films might look as this big Hollywood studio influencing and taking this small Bristol-based company out and sort of, smacking it into the world. So there was a real emphasis, I think, certainly reading around the film, that Aardman weren't losing their sensibility and actually were having as much of an influence on DreamWorks as DreamWorks were having on them.
It's interesting. And yeah, the temptation is to read that back into the narrative. We should do some. We should do some of the narrative because there's lots of bits to it. In fact, it's quite a bitty movie in many ways. I've written down episodic quality, and it reminded me almost a little bit of Snow White in that the film is kind of. It's almost, it's these sections of the movie that you could almost imagine the labour. Maybe it is done like this. The labour is divvied up where, like, you do the 15 minutes in Toad Hall or wherever it is. You do it when they're at when they go visit Rita's family, and there's this whole sort of extended like rat family scenario. You do that bit, and we'll divvy it up that way. And the journey narrative stitches together all these little bits and pieces. But there are lots of bits and pieces, so perhaps we should sort of go through some of our favourite bits. I guess we should start with this kind of antagonist of the movie, maybe, which is take it away.
Well, it's Ian McKellen. It's a good thing. Well, I'm surprised there's much scenery. It's a good thing it's virtual scenery because he would be chewing that scenery. There'd be teeth marks. So yeah, Ian McKellen is Toad, and you've also got, a quite problematic Le Frog, voiced by Jean Reno.
Yes, I've got stuff to say about that, but carry on.
Le Frog, and then a couple of, I think that the sort of light relief, the Timon, the antagonistic Timon and Pumbaa. So Andy Serkis as Spike and Bill Nighy as Whitey. So a couple of hench rats that sort of do the dirty work of Toad. Now, Toad is this kind of really, I guess, he's outwardly, and it's interesting that he's a toad and not a rat and not a villainous rat, because he's immediately sort of identified as other, and you have Roddy and Rita's relationship is shored up relatively quickly, and they are sort of the film's buddy at the and then you have this sort of, I don't know, strange. I think it's revealed at one point that Toad was Prince Charles's pet. He's really sort of nationalistic, and it's a really strange. It's just really strange, and it is interesting that he's a toad, because what that then allows the film to do is play with elements of his toadness and his kind of tongue and his predilection for flies and his kind of grotesque nature. And so there is something striking about his, and there's all this narrative about fake and real rubies and wanting to wash away the world below and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, Toad wants to flood, I think it's halftime during the World Cup, when all the humans are likely going to be using their toilets. So flushed away is not just a convenient narrative device, it is the entire narrative drama. And then Ratropolis is a sort of kind of quite literal figurative cleansing of the world down below. But Ian McKellen is chewing. This is not a review podcast, but he is chewing some scenery. I'll give him that.
And I think there's not much time, or I'm not really sure I've got anything insightful to say about it, but I think there is also something murky about the sort of effeminacy of this character, and Ian McKellen's performance, and the pairing of star voice with kind of Camp Frog is it's not Carry On Camp, but there's a certain queering of the figure in an equation between queer identity and villainous identity that's sort of quite Silence of the Lambs almost esque, that I think is worth sort of at least flagging up.
Well, as you were talking, I was thinking about pantomime and kind of British theatrical traditions of pantomime, and I remember, I'm now frantically looking this up, but I remember Ian McKellen being in a pantomime, I think at the Old Vic or something, and obviously traditions of the Dame and all that sort of stuff. And yeah, you're right. I think, so Ian McKellen was Widow Twankey in Aladdin at the Old Vic. There we go. Don't know when that was.
Well, he's kind of also Widow Twankey in Flushed Away.
Yes, well, that's what I was. Actually, it's interesting. He was at Aladdin at the Old Vic for between 2004 and 2006, and then took on the role of Toad. So there we go. It's Flushed Away is the sequel to the Old Vic's Aladdin that we never knew we needed. But there is. You're right. There's something around the sort of the way in which, kind of, obviously animation is a pantomimic form because it's silent, and it is given voice through the star voices that you mentioned. So there is something around the art of performance and a hyperactivity, and actually works really nicely with Roddy, who's very reserved and very. And I wonder whether that's to do with Hugh Jackman, who's putting on this upper-class English accent. There's a level of pretense at the level of voice that is then manifest in the... He doesn't want to give too much away, whereas something very open about McKellen's performance as this sort of Toad-like grotesque figure. But there's something interesting around... I haven't quite thought it through, but I was thinking about, kind of the queerness of animation's identity or ontology as a queer medium, but then also these sorts of really sort of British traditions of the Dame and the idea of performance and theatrical performance and that kind of stuff.
And then you've got Le Frog, and I don't know what to make, because I think it'd be really, again, boring and clumsy just to go, well, it's a xenophobic stereotype of a French person, which it is, but I'm not sure what I made of it, because there's a certain, and this is kind of true of a lot of Aardman movies, there's a certain kind of Beano infused British humour that kind of delights in the silliness of these kinds of stereotypes. So the idea, the fact that it's that the character is called Le Frog and is a French frog, there's a certain, I don't know, almost it's so stereotypical as to sort of to become almost a fantasy of stereotypes, in that, like, I don't think it's affirming that stereotype's existence. It's almost delighting in the absurdity of the stereotype itself. Now, I'm not excusing it entirely that way, but there is a lot of this kind of British humour where I'm not sure if the joke is that, hey, isn't it funny that he's French? Or if the joke is, hey, isn't it funny that we say this about French people and it's absurd? And part of the national identity building of the film is we do make these jokes about French and they're silly, but they're our jokes, so we can kind of claim them, and that's funny. And there's another one I think I found more problematic, maybe just because I've grown up in Britain and those kind of jokes have thrown around more. But there's another, like, brief moment where they accidentally call a Chinese takeaway. And there's this, like, really, really kind of, Mickey Rooney in Breakfast and Tiffany's-esque sort of, voice on the other end of the line, trying to see what kind of order they're taking. And again, it's kind of tripping the line between being so racially characteristic as to seem to almost be offering itself up as a fantasy. Now, I'm not excusing it, and I'm not defending it either. And I'm not celebrating it, but I'm also... I think it's in some weird, murky world, but it trips my interest, because I'm always interested in films that announce their lack of representation in moments and what we do with that politically. And I still don't really have an answer for it. But part of me thinks that the pleasure in it isn't in the reality of those stereotypes. It's in the fantasy of those stereotypes, for better or for worse.
No, I don't really have... Well, I don't have much to add. I was thinking about what you said about Beano humour and comics, and obviously comics' relationship to animation, but also a degree of anarchy in stuff like the Beano, and the cheekiness of it and the mischievousness of it. It's on the same level as kind of the postcards of the sort of naughty postcards, or the image of the old man at the beach with the hanky tied on his head. But you're right that this film does some interesting things when Lafrogue says, "You stupid English with your Yorkshire puddings and your chips and fish, you thought you could defeat Lafrogue." And you're right. And let's not forget that the whole film, as I said, is based on is set against the backdrop of England versus Germany at the World Cup. So it really nails its colours to the masts, whatever it is. Insert your analogy here at the start, in terms of it's set against the backdrop of an adversarial relationship between two countries who, let's face it, have got a history. And of course it's hilarious that England don't win the World Cup or never win the World Cup. We'll play on that trope as well. But then you have
and also there's a certain, again, it depends on what part of the population you're tapping into, but there's a certain knowingness of the one-sided nature of that Germany versus England rivalry, in that, just at a football level, we all, or most of us, I would hope, again, I'm making speculations here, but certainly one way of identifying with that is that a lot of us know that we care a lot more about beating Germany than Germany care about beating England, because they're essentially a much, much, much better football team than us. So why would they care about beating us? And part of there's almost a sort of masochistic nationalist pleasure in caring more about something than the other side, because it brings you together rather than it saying anything about the other side, that I think the film is trying to play with. As I say, I'm thinking my way through this, but I'm always keen to complicate things when people are like, okay, well, in this movie there is this silly French frog, therefore it's a xenophobic stereotype and it's harmful. Because I think there is a way of reading these things as being quite clearly evocative of things that don't exist. And I think we have to treat the representation of fantasy very different to we do the representation of reality, because they are different playing grounds. But still, don't know what to do with it.
Well, part of me wants to reclaim the film and say, well, the casting of Jean Reno as a frog is playing, this film was released the same year as the film adaptation of the Da Vinci Code, and he plays a similar sort of police chief in that. And you don't know whether he's the villain, as with all Dan Brown books with their one-page chapters. You don't quite know who the villain is until the very end, unless one of the characters' name is Spanish for red herring. Apart from that, we kind of vaguely don't know who it's going to be, and so part of me thinks that Renault, as a voice artist, was particularly important around that time. He voiced I think he voiced the museum guide around the Louvre at the time, and so he was particularly. I mean, he has a long-standing and wonderful history in French cinema, but had recently, 95, made the kind of relative crossover. He'd done Leon, but he'd also done Mission Impossible as well. And he, in terms of dubbing practices, he also dubbed the character in the French version. And obviously, we've talked previously on the podcast about the circulation of movies and animation dubbed into foreign language. So he's a star. He's a star in both the UK and America and in France. And this helps the film's transportability. So I'm tempted to sort of celebrate the film on that level. And then at the same time, it does tap into this sort of national imaginary and the idea that nationhood and identity are what we collectively believe it to be. And what we collectively believe it to be are jokes about fish and chips and whatever, and that sort of that juvenile comic humour that is particularly knowing and ironic and I don't know, something the way that a certain level of British humour that has often, I think Paul Wells has written about British humour in cartoons and traditions of postcards and early British animated series like Jerry the Troublesome Tyke, right up to sort of Joanna Quinn's work, Beryl, her sort of cartoons about gender, and then Aardman as well. And so I don't know, are Aardman in this tradition of a certain kinds of juvenile, childish, and I mean these in a positive way, but as a part of a juvenile storytelling tradition that has its origins in the scrapes and the japes of, rather than sophistication. It's a little bit more grubby. Maybe it's the Beano is the world down below, and a novel is the world up top.
Well, I guess the question I would pose is it a national imaginary or is it a national fantastic? And those are two different things. In that a national imaginary is a functioning fantasy people use to make sense of their lives and affirm certain things about the objective, interconnected world. And a national fantastic would be something we know is impossible and yet enjoy encountering regardless of that knowledge. And both can be politically problematic, and both can be politically subversive, and both can affirm and both can disavow and all that kind of stuff. But they do it in very different ways, and I think often we conflate the two at our peril. But we must finish the story. The evil toad is going to flush everybody away.
Yep.
We get a brief diversion to sort of Ruby's family. We meet all her sort of brothers and sisters, and of course Hugh Jackman sings at one point because
he's the greatest showman, Alex.
Because he's the greatest showman. How many Hugh Jackman movies have we done? This is our third Hugh Jackman movie.
Yeah. We've got a bit of a way to go. We'll as long as we do as long as we, in fact, in one episode, didn't we also make?
Yeah, we talked about the Prestige.
Yeah. Great. So we're making our way through them. Carry on.
Fine. Yes. So of course he sings for a bit, and then the sort of the madcap adventure plays out. And interestingly, Woody does not go back to the bedroom. He decides that it's actually we're gonna get a spoiler alert. We get a Toy Story 4 going on, and he decides that actually it's more fun down in the dirt.
Yeah.
With the rats. So he joins Ruby on her sort of quest, and we get that reconciliation, I guess, between all these different tensions. So the film tries to reconcile these things through the bringing together of this couple in the film. Do we have? I feel like we should probably do wrap-ups and final moments and best bits and all this kind of stuff. Are there any bits, Chris, that we should cover that we haven't covered?
First of all, I think this is a really interesting film when considered in partnership with Arthur Christmas, because these two films do stand alone as really intriguing footnotes between the world of plasticine and the world of computer pixels. So I think these are, when we look back at Aardman's history, and of course they've not yet gone back to fully computer animated films thus far, these are seem particularly playful. I think what I like in the film, there's a moment where Roddy is trying on clothes right at the start, trying on loads and loads of clothes, and he pulls out like a tuxedo. He pulls out a Wolverine costume at one point as a little playful nod to Jackman. We will get onto X-Men, I'm sure, in a future episode.
And he pulls out a Wallace and Gromit.
He does.
A Wallace outfit. Yeah. Thanks
for stealing my favourite moment.
Sorry.
No. But it's a nice. You're right. He pulls out Wallace's iconic green tank top, white shirt, and red tie, and holds it up against his body. And I thought that's a nice little moment where it's a rodent dressed in familiar clothes, albeit briefly, but it sort of superimposes Aardman's claymation past onto its computer animated present. And I really like that self-reflexive gesture that sort of dresses up new Aardman in old clothes. And then he sort of discards it again, and it's a nice little joke. And there are lots of little intertextual references, as I mentioned. So there are toys in Roddy's room, or Roddy's owner's room, who we never see, the young girl. Stuffed toys of characters from Madagascar, DreamWorks film, and Shrek, and it's trying to sort of please a lot of people. But I really liked that moment where Roddy's clothes, when he holds up Wallace's clothing, it momentarily points to sort of Flushed Away as that curious meeting point for ultimately a divergent set of values that are always, it seems in the way that we've talked about Flushed Away, a film where these values are trying to vie for visibility and ascendancy. And which is it, more Aardman or is it more DreamWorks? And how does that play out formally? How does that play out industrially? Why is it so interesting that there was such an emphasis on this film being true to the Aardman style at the same time as being also a DreamWorks film in their mod? So I like that moment because it crystallizes a lot of some of the stuff we've been saying. And of course, who doesn't love Ian McKellen?
Understand LeFrog, understand the movie.
Sure.
It's like the totem in Inception.
Yeah. It's exactly like the totem in Inception. So there we go.
On that note,
yes.
Chris's book is still out there. I'll say it because he won't. You can buy it in paperback through all known booksellers, independent or otherwise. Or if you wish to order it for your library, if you are an academic out there, please do that as well so that your students can access it. There is a wonderful case study on Flushed Away which speaks to a lot of the things we've talked about on this podcast already, so please do access it.
And I will say it because he won't. Not only is his book on Hollywood fantasy imminent, but we both wrote chapters for a book on Aardman that was edited by Annabelle Honus-Rowe, Aardman Animations Beyond Stop Motion, and where I waffle on about Flushed Away and Arthur Christmas along similar sorts of lines. Alex is chapter looks at the British. I think some of the things around the British idea of the British fantasy tradition, which obviously we touched on when we did Pirates in an Adventure with Scientists. So there we go. If you want to check out some work on Aardman, do have a look at the and also what Aardman is for us as kind of scholars. This really interesting studio that has retained a certain degree of Britishness in the face of a shifting animation landscape around it. So yeah, Aardman Animations beyond stop motion. Read that and then go and buy Alex's forthcoming book.
You can find us, of course, at fantasy-animation.org, where you can access our blog posts and an archive of podcasts. There's one on pirates, apparently. I didn't know that at the beginning of the episode. Please do access it, and maybe I'll listen to it afterwards and remind myself of all the fascinating things we spoke about on that episode, I'm sure. Remember, you can get in contact with us via our social media accounts, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Reddit, and the handle for all four is at FanAnim Research, FANANIM Research. Do give us some feedback, do take part in the conversations. And if you're out there and would like to follow up on any of the ideas, Chris would love a blog post submission, so you can get in contact via our website on that. Oh, and our email address, fananimresearch at gmail.com. I think that's everything for another episode, though. So thanks, Chris, for talking me through Flushed Away. I feel thoroughly versed. And we'll have to do Arthur Christmas sometime as well.
Yes, that can be our Christmas episode that we record sometime in the summer.
Yeah, well, we'll just hang on the line and we'll do it now.
Yeah.
Listeners, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Let's go, people. Chop, chop.
Nope. 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 Nope.
Buckle up, everyone.